Providence Municipal Court had processed thousands of routine speeding tickets. But on Tuesday morning, December 12th, a day that began like any other would become the moment Judge Frank Caprio came face to face with a man who had once stood between the President of the United States and potential assassins, when a sharply dressed African-American man entered the courtroom, moving with the unmistakable bearing of federal law enforcement, something in his silent confidence. The way he naturally positioned himself near the exit triggered an instant recognition. What followed would uncover one of the most heartbreaking family tragedies ever heard in that courtroom. The encounter soon became the most emotional moment in Judge Caprio's 4-decade career, proving that those who serve their country at the highest levels often face the most devastating personal battles in complete silence. Tuesday morning had settled into its usual rhythm. Judge Caprio, now 80 years old, presided with the calm routine that had carried him through thousands of cases, traffic violations, parking disputes, minor infractions. The gallery was filled with the usual mix of anxious drivers, frustrated commuters, and hopeful individuals praying the judge's compassion might extend to them. At exactly 9:32 a.m., when David Thompson walked through the doors, the energy shifted almost imperceptibly. He appeared to be in his early 50s, standing 6 feet tall, gray at the temples, with a posture carved by decades of military and federal training. His dark suit was immaculate, his shoes mirror-polished, and he moved with the fluid, controlled awareness of someone who had spent years scanning crowds for threats, but it wasn't his appearance that caught the judge's attention. It was the way his eyes assessed every entrance and exit. The careful position he chose, giving him full sightlines of all access points. The unconscious readiness of his hands. These were instincts, not habits, instincts shaped by years of executive protection. People in the gallery noticed it too. Looks like FBI, someone whispered, maybe Secret Service, another murmured. David Thompson sat with a quiet dignity, hands folded, completely composed, showing none of the nervous energy that strained the others waiting for their cases. Court reporter Margaret Walsh, who had documented Judge Caprio's cases for 18 years, noted the unusual stillness. People facing charges typically fidgeted, whispered, or checked their phones. David did none of that. He waited with the patience of a man who had spent long hours in silent vigilance. When Bailiff Officer Martinez finally called his case at 10:15 a.m., the state of Rhode Island versus David Michael Thompson. Excessive speed in a school zone. David rose with military precision. His movements were so controlled they immediately captured the judge's trained eye. Please state your name for the record, Judge Caprio said. David Michael Thompson, Your Honor, he replied, his voice steady, authoritative, with a hint of a Chicago accent. Mr. Thompson, the citation states you were traveling 45 miles per hour in a 25-mile school zone on November 28 at approximately 2:47 p.m. How do you plead? Guilty, Your Honor, David responded without hesitation. I was speeding, and I take full responsibility. His immediate admission surprised some. People with his background usually defended themselves. But Caprio recognized the tone, a man who accepted accountability without excuse. Mr. Thompson, can you explain the circumstances that led to this violation? For the first time, David hesitated. Something flickered across his face, controlled desperation, not defiance. A fracture in an otherwise impenetrable exterior, Your Honor. I was rushing to reach my son at his school. I'd received a call from the principal. They said there was an urgent situation requiring my immediate presence. Judge Caprio leaned in. Emergencies involving children always changed the nature of a case, but something in David's voice hinted at something deeper. What kind of urgent situation was this? The judge asked. David's jaw tightened. For a man trained to suppress emotion, the tension said everything. Your Honor, my son has been struggling with severe depression and anxiety. The principal called to inform me that he had written what appeared to be a suicide note. They were concerned for his immediate safety. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. This was no ordinary traffic case. This was a father racing to stop his child from taking his own life. David lifted his eyes, meeting Judge Caprio's. In that single moment, the judge no longer saw the polished professional, the protector who had once guarded national leaders. He saw a father carrying a pain deeper than any battlefield wound. "Your Honor," he continued quietly, voice steady but weighted with grief, "I served on the presidential security detail for President Barack Obama for 6 years, from 2009 to 2015. The revelation struck the courtroom like a bolt of electricity. Barack Obama, one of the most respected and beloved figures in modern American politics, had been protected for years by the man now standing before Judge Caprio for a simple traffic violation. Everyone in the room instantly understood that this was no routine case. This was an extraordinary moment. Judge Caprio's eyes widened with recognition and a quiet sense of awe. This wasn't just any defendant. This was a man who had literally placed himself between the President of the United States and potential assassins every single day for 6 years. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Caprio said, his voice shifting to a tone of deep respect, "when you say you served on President Obama's security detail, what exactly was your role?" "I was part of the counter-assault team for 6 years, Your Honor," David replied. "My job was to neutralize threats against the president during public events, during travel, and at the White House and other secured locations." Whispers rippled across the gallery. People leaned in, stunned, some discreetly pulling out their phones, no doubt scrolling through old photos from Obama's presidency, wondering if they could find David Thompson in the background. Judge Caprio himself needed a second to absorb the weight of having someone with such a service record in his courtroom. "Mr. Thompson," the judge asked gently, "are you still with the Secret Service?" "No, Your Honor. I retired from federal service in 2015. "And why did you leave?" the judge asked carefully, "if you're comfortable sharing that in open court." David was silent for a long moment. Everyone could see the internal struggle, the battle between privacy and truth. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that had changed the course of his life. "Your Honor, my son was diagnosed with severe clinical depression and anxiety when he was 12. My work with the Secret Service, the travel, the long hours, the secrecy, made it nearly impossible to be the father he needed." A chill moved through the courtroom. David Thompson had walked away from one of the most elite assignments in federal law enforcement to care for his mentally ill child. "That must have been a very difficult choice," Judge Caprio said quietly. "Yes, Your Honor. But my son was more important than my career. I could protect the President of the United States, but I couldn't protect my own child from his depression. The only way to help him was to be present." The judge was beginning to understand the true magnitude of David's sacrifice. Most Secret Service agents who served on presidential details moved on to high-paying careers in private security or corporate protection. David had given all of that up to save his son. "And how has your son been since you left the service?" Judge Caprio asked. David's controlled exterior finally cracked, just slightly, but enough for the judge to see the agony behind his calm expression. "It's been a struggle, Your Honor. Some years better than others. He's had multiple hospitalizations, countless medication changes, ongoing therapy. Having me home helped, for a while. But depression is a relentless enemy." "Mr. Thompson," the judge said softly, "you mentioned the suicide note. Can you tell me what happened that day?" David inhaled slowly, steadying himself. He was preparing to share the most painful moment of his life with total strangers. "Your Honor, my son had seemed to be improving. He was going to school, participating more, even talking about college. But depression hides." On November 28, his English teacher found a note he had written. It looked like a goodbye letter. What did it say? Judge Caprio asked gently. He wrote that he was tired of being a burden. That he would never be able to live up to being the son of a man who had protected the president. He said everyone expected him to be strong like his father, but he felt weak and broken every day. The room went silent. Several people wiped at their eyes. Judge Caprio himself felt his throat tighten. Your Honor, David continued, he wrote that he knew I had sacrificed my career for him, and that the guilt of that sacrifice was making his depression worse. He thought everyone would be better off if he wasn't alive. Judge Caprio felt the brutal irony like a punch to the chest. David had given up everything to save his son, only for that sacrifice to deepen the boy's pain. When you got the call from the school, the judge asked softly, what went through your mind? Terror, Your Honor. Absolute terror. I spent 6 years prepared to take a bullet for President Obama. But nothing in my training prepared me for the possibility that I could lose my son to his own mind. The courtroom held its breath as David's voice broke, just slightly. I got in my car and drove as fast as I could. Because I knew that every minute, every second, could mean the difference between life and death. He had become the face of a much larger human struggle. And when you arrived at the school, Judge Caprio asked gently. He was alive, Your Honor, David said. The school counselor had been speaking with him, and they convinced him to wait until I arrived. But seeing him sitting there, so small, so defeated, knowing that my love for him had somehow become part of his suffering, that was the hardest moment of my life. Judge Caprio felt the weight of those words. David Thompson embodied a profound truth about service and sacrifice. Here was a man who had spent years shielding the leader of the free world from danger, yet his greatest and most devastating battle was taking place at home, against an enemy no training or tactical preparation could defeat, and what David was about to reveal would make it clear. The strongest people often carry the deepest wounds. Judge Caprio leaned back, absorbing the gravity of what he was hearing. David Thompson wasn't just another name on a docket. He was a father trapped between two worlds, one defined by elite government service, the other defined by fear, love, and a desperate fight to save his child. Mr. Thompson, the judge said carefully, I need to ask something, not as a judge reviewing a speeding ticket, but as someone trying to understand the full weight on your shoulders. How are you supporting your family since leaving the Secret Service? It was a delicate question. Judge Caprio knew someone with David's background could earn a high salary in private security. But he also knew the demands of caring for a mentally ill child could make those opportunities impossible. Your Honor, David replied, I currently work as a security consultant for small businesses and private clients. The pay is far less than what I earned with the Secret Service, but it gives me the flexibility to be available whenever my son needs me. And how much less? Judge Caprio asked softly. If you're comfortable sharing. David hesitated, the vulnerability obvious, but the judge's genuine concern gave him the courage to continue. About 70% less, Your Honor. I went from earning around $95,000 a year with full federal benefits, to about $28,000 per year. No health insurance. A ripple of shock passed through the courtroom. David Thompson had willingly sacrificed nearly $70,000 a year to care for his child. Mr. Thompson, the judge continued, with that dramatic drop in income, how do you manage your son's medical expenses? It's a constant struggle, Your Honor, David said. Mental health care is extremely expensive, especially without insurance. He exhaled, as if releasing a burden he'd carried far too long. My son sees a psychiatrist once a month, $200 each visit. A therapist every week, $120 per session. His medications cost about $400 a month. That's more than $1,000 every month just for his basic treatment. Judge Caprio did the math in his head. Nearly half of David's income was being spent solely on his son's mental health care. Mr. Thompson, he said quietly, that's nearly 40% of your gross income. How do you afford housing, food, and everything else? We've had to downsize our entire lives, Your Honor. We left our home in Washington, D.C., and moved into a small apartment here in Providence. I drive a 15-year-old car. We buy food from discount stores. We use assistance when we have to. But my son's treatment, there is no alternative. It has to come first. Judge Caprio now understood the full picture. David Thompson had gone from the pinnacle of federal service to barely scraping by, all in the name of saving his child. Mr. Thompson, the judge asked gently, on the day you were rushing to the school, were you able to afford whatever emergency psychiatric intervention your son might have needed? David's expression tightened with a pain that words could hardly convey. No, Your Honor. That's part of what made it so terrifying. If he had needed immediate hospitalization, I didn't have the money for it. I wasn't just racing to save his life. I was racing there knowing I might not be able to afford the help he needed to stay alive. The cruelty of it hit everyone in the room. A man who had devoted his life to protecting others, couldn't afford to protect his own child. And what happened after you arrived at the school? The judge asked quietly. The counselor had de-escalated the crisis, David said, but she recommended he go to the hospital for evaluation. I knew that would mean a psychiatric hold, and I knew we couldn't afford it. But his life mattered more than any bill. So yes, Your Honor. I took him. And was he hospitalized? Yes. He was admitted for a 72-hour psychiatric hold. The total cost was $8,400. I couldn't pay anything up front. The hospital placed me on a payment plan, $350 a month, for the next 2 years. Judge Caprio realized that David Thompson was now spending over $1,350 every month on his son's mental health care, more than half of everything he earned. And here's the part that truly breaks my heart, and I want you to comment below. Do you believe our healthcare system is failing families like David's? Because what he tells Judge Caprio next about the impossible choices he faces will make you understand why this speeding ticket represents far more than a simple traffic offense, Mr. Thompson. The judge continued gently, with these financial burdens, how do you handle your everyday expenses? David lowered his eyes. We don't handle them well, Your Honor. Some months I have to choose between buying groceries and paying for my son's therapy. Some weeks I work back-to-back security shifts just to afford his medication. And there are days when I wonder if I made a mistake leaving the Secret Service, if he would have gotten better care if I had stayed and kept the higher salary. The pain in his voice was unmistakable. Judge Caprio felt his heart tightening for a man who was questioning the most selfless decision he'd ever made. Mr. Thompson, the judge asked softly, do you regret leaving the Secret Service? David took a long, steady breath before answering, his voice filled with both certainty and sorrow. No, Your Honor. My son needed me present more than he needed me earning a big paycheck. But I do regret that we live in a country where a parent has to choose between being there for their child, and being able to pay for that same child's medical care. Judge Caprio now saw the full reality. This wasn't an individual failure, this was a system that had pushed countless families like David's into impossible corners, forcing them to choose between love and survival. Mr. Thompson, the judge continued, on the day you received the speeding ticket, after everything you were dealing with, what was going through your mind? This time, David's composure finally shattered. Honestly, Your Honor, it felt like the last punch I could take. I had spent 3 days in the hospital beside my son, wondering how I would pay for the treatment that kept him alive. And then suddenly I'm facing a $195 ticket, money that has to come out of a budget that's already impossible. Judge Caprio understood, this was never about speeding, this was about a system that punishes parents for trying to save their own children. and then punishes them again for being poor, and what happened next would prove that sometimes true justice requires far more than simply applying the law, because Judge Caprio was about to do something that would change David Thompson's life, and remind everyone watching that compassion still exists inside the justice system. Judge Caprio slowly stood, stepping down from his bench, a rare moment that sent a wave of shock through the courtroom. In 4 decades of serving as a judge, he almost never left his seat of authority to speak to someone face to face. "Mr. Thompson," he began, his voice rich with the moral force that made him beloved worldwide, "in all my years on this bench, I have never seen a case that so clearly shows both the best of humanity and the failures of our system." He walked toward David, every eye in the courtroom fixed on the moment. "Let me tell you what I see when I look at you," Caprio continued. "I see a man who served his country, ready to risk his life at a moment's notice. I see a father who gave up financial security, prestige, and career advancement just to be present for a child who needed him. And I see someone who is being failed by a system that should be lifting him up, not tearing him down." David's emotional armor finally cracked, the weight of years of sacrifice beginning to show in his trembling hands. "Before I tell you what Judge Caprio does next, I need everyone watching to answer this. When was the last time you saw someone in power choose what's morally right over what's legally convenient? Comment below. And if this moment is hitting you emotionally, smash that subscribe button, because Judge Stories is on the road to 600K, and we document moments that prove humanity still exists. Mr. Thompson," Judge Caprio continued, "what you did, putting your child before your career, is everything that true fatherhood stands for. In a world where too many parents chase status and money, you chose presence. You chose sacrifice. You chose love." Judge Caprio's voice rose with a fiery sense of moral conviction, the same force that had turned his courtroom into a place known for moments of rare humanity. "But before I continue," he said, sweeping his gaze across the room, "I want everyone here to understand exactly what we're witnessing." He paused so the weight of his words could settle. "We are looking at a father who has poured every last ounce of himself into keeping his child alive, and is now being punished for the desperation that drove him to speed toward a school where his son was on the verge of ending his own life." The judge turned toward the gallery, speaking not only to David, but to every single person in the courtroom. "Mr. Thompson, you weren't speeding to avoid responsibility. You weren't speeding for personal gain. You were speeding because you were trying to reach your child before he took his life. You were running toward the person you love more than anything in this world." Judge Caprio walked back toward the bench, but instead of ascending the steps, he stopped directly in front of David. "Mr. Thompson," he said quietly, "regarding the speeding citation that brought you into this courtroom today," he took a breath, "all charges are dismissed. Every fine is waived. All penalties are completely removed from your record." The courtroom broke into spontaneous applause, but Judge Caprio raised his hand gently, signaling that he wasn't finished. "Let me be clear," he continued, his tone now intense with purpose, "this case reflects a much deeper injustice." His face grew serious as he spoke with the authority of someone who had watched the legal system intersect with real human suffering for decades. "Mr. Thompson, you spent years protecting the most powerful office in the United States. And yet today you struggle to pay for the most basic mental health care for your child. That is a moral failure of our society, one that extends far beyond this courtroom or this traffic violation." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I am going to do something I very rarely do in municipal court," the judge announced. "I will personally write a formal letter to our state's mental health services department, outlining your family's situation and requesting immediate assistance with your son's medical expenses." David Thompson's eyes filled with tears. For the first time in years, someone in authority wasn't just judging him, they were helping him carry a burden he had long shouldered alone. And here's the moment that will break your heart. Have you ever seen a judge show this level of compassion? Comment below, because what Judge Caprio says next deserves to be quoted in classrooms for generations. Furthermore, he continued, I will personally contact local mental health organizations to explore creating a fund specifically for families like yours, families where parents have sacrificed their careers to care for mentally ill children. His voice now carried the full gravity of his moral stance. Mr. Thompson, hear me clearly, you are not a failure. You are a hero. You left a prestigious position so you could be present for your son in his darkest moments. That is the very definition of courage, of fatherhood, of love. He addressed not only David, but the entire room. Your child is battling depression. But he has something many children in similar situations do not, a father who has shown, through sacrifice after sacrifice, that his child's life is worth every struggle. Judge Caprio turned to the gallery. We live in a society that claims to prioritize families, claims to support mental health, yet forces parents to choose between being physically present for their children and being able to pay for their children's treatment. David Thompson should never have had to make that choice. And the speeding ticket he received should never have existed, because his desperate race to save his son's life should never have been necessary. The applause returned, louder, longer, more emotional. People stood, not just for the judge, but for David, a father who had sacrificed everything, and a system that had failed him. Judge Caprio took a moment before delivering the final words that would echo far beyond the courtroom. Mr. Thompson, he said, I want to make you a promise. Your story does not end with this dismissed ticket. I will make sure people understand what real sacrifice looks like. I will make sure your son knows that his father is a hero. And I will make sure other families fighting similar battles know they are not alone. David Thompson broke down completely. The man who had once stood inches from danger to protect the president now stood overwhelmed by the simple act of someone finally understanding his pain. If this moment doesn't move you, check your pulse. This, exactly this, is why Judge Stories exists. This is why we document these extraordinary moments of compassion, courage, and humanity. Judge Caprio's voice softened. Mr. Thompson, he said gently, when your son asks someday why you left your respected career, tell him this: you chose to be the kind of father who shows up. You chose presence over prestige. You chose love over ambition. The judge let the words hang in the air. Your service to President Obama was honorable. But your service to your son, that is heroic. Anyone can learn protective strategies or security protocols. Not everyone can learn the kind of selfless love that leads a father to give up everything for his child. He turned one final time to the gallery. I hope everyone here remembers David Thompson's story. Heroes don't always wear uniforms or badges. Sometimes they wear simple suits, work multiple jobs, and quietly sacrifice $70,000 salaries, just to keep their children alive. As David prepared to leave the courtroom, the room remained standing, honoring not just a judge's compassion, but a father's unbreakable love. As David prepared to leave the courtroom, several people approached him with offers of help and support. A local psychiatrist handed him her card, offering sessions at a reduced rate. A woman from the gallery, identifying herself as a social worker, offered to guide him through available mental health assistance programs. But the most remarkable part of this story, and I want you to comment below on this, happened within just 2 weeks. Judge Caprio's letter to the state mental health department resulted in David's family being approved for emergency assistance that covered 80% of his son's treatment costs. A local news station shared their story, prompting community donations to cover the remaining expenses. A mental health advocacy organization offered David a position as a family liaison specialist, work that allowed him to support his family while helping other parents facing similar crises. Most importantly, David's son began to show real improvement. The knowledge that his father's sacrifices were recognized and supported by the community lifted much of the guilt that had fueled his depression. He later wrote a letter to Judge Caprio, "You didn't just dismiss my dad's ticket. You helped save my life by showing me that his love for me is something to be proud of, not guilty about." 6 months later, David returned to court, not as a defendant, but to update Judge Caprio on his son's progress and to personally thank him for catalyzing the support that had transformed their lives. The lesson here is profound. True heroism isn't always about dramatic action. Sometimes, it's about quiet, consistent sacrifice. David Thompson showed us that even those who serve our country at the highest levels are parents facing the same struggles as anyone else. And he reminded us that the most crucial protection we can provide isn't for presidents or celebrities, it's for our own children. If this story moved you, here's what you should do right now: subscribe to Truth and Power to see moments that prove our legal system can still show compassion. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that seeking help for mental health is a sign of strength, not weakness. Comment below and let us know, do you think society does enough to support families dealing with mental health crises?